Sarah Jakes Roberts has become a voice of hope and change in today's world of ministry. As the daughter of Bishop T.D. Jakes, she carries a powerful legacy, but what makes her stand out is that she built her own path in her own way. Her life story is not perfect. She has faced struggles, mistakes, and seasons where she had to rebuild herself. But it is exactly because of those experiences that people connect to her so deeply. When she speaks, it doesn't feel like theory or empty words. It feels like life lessons born from real pain and real healing. This is why thousands, especially young women, see her as a source of encouragement and strength. On the other side stands Juanita Bynum, a name that has carried weight in ministry for decades. In the 1990s and early 2000s, her voice was like a fire that moved through churches and conferences around the world. Her prayers, her passion, and her boldness made her a spiritual force that touched countless lives. For many, Juanita is a living reminder of what they call the golden age of ministry, when preaching was raw, deep, and uncompromising. Her name is tied to a legacy of powerful sermons that still echo in the hearts of those who grew up under her influence. Both women have the same goal, to lead people closer to God, but the difference lies in their approach. Sarah represents a new wave, one that embraces creativity, relevance, and the language of a generation that lives online and seeks authenticity more than tradition. Juanita represents the weight of history, discipline, and the roots of ministry that shaped countless churches. These two paths, though different, eventually create a quiet comparison. And in time, that comparison becomes louder, leading to conversations that are no longer just about style, but about what the future of ministry truly looks like. The tension began quietly, almost like a whisper in the background of the church world. Juanita Bynum, while speaking at one of her gatherings, made a statement that many could not ignore. With a strong and emotional tone, she declared that in today's time, too many new preachers are chasing lights, crowds, and popularity rather than the true depth of God's word. She never mentioned a name, but the words carried weight, and for many listeners, the message pointed directly at the younger generation of ministers, with Sarah Jakes Roberts standing at the center of that image. The audience in the room reacted with nods and amens, but once the clip of Juanita's words reached social media, the reaction was very different. People began to dissect her statement, and debates erupted online. Some strongly agreed with her, saying that modern ministry feels more like entertainment, with polished stages, trendy clothes, and catchy phrases. Others quickly came to Sarah's defense, arguing that her style might be modern, but her heart is deeply rooted in faith and truth. Soon, hashtags and heated posts started spreading across platforms. Blogs and Christian media outlets published articles with headlines like, "Legacy Leader Challenges the New Generation," and "Has Ministry Become a Show?" The words of Juanita were no longer just a sermon moment. They had sparked a full-blown conversation that crossed church walls and spilled into the public space. And in the middle of it all was Sarah Jakes Roberts. She remained silent at first, choosing not to respond quickly. But the world was waiting to see if she would say something. The quiet comparison between legacy and new wave had now turned into an open question. Would Sarah stand firm in her calling, or would she allow the weight of criticism to define her? For several weeks, Sarah Jakes Roberts stayed silent. She carried on with her schedule, preaching at her church, speaking at conferences, and sharing her usual encouraging messages online. But beneath the surface, the weight of the words directed at her lingered. She knew people were watching closely, waiting for her to break her silence. And when she finally did, it wasn't through a press statement or a social media rant. It was through her pulpit. At a large women's conference, Sarah stood before the crowd with her usual calm presence. But this time, her words carried a different kind of fire. She spoke about how every generation has its own language, its own way of expressing faith, and its own way of reaching souls. "The gospel never changes," she said firmly, but the way we deliver it must be able to reach the people where they are. Her statement was simple, but it struck deep. Without mentioning Juanita by name, Sarah made it clear that she believed her style of ministry was not about chasing fame or trends. It was about meeting people in the reality of their lives today. She went on to share a personal reflection. "I know what it's like to feel broken. I know what it's like to feel overlooked. And I also know that God can still use that pain as a platform to heal others. So if I dress differently, if I speak differently, it's not because I want attention. It's because I want someone who feels like me to know that God sees them too." The crowd erupted in applause, many with tears in their eyes. To them, this was more than a response. It was a declaration of Sarah's identity in ministry. She was not trying to replace the legacy of those who came before her. She was trying to honor it, while also carving out space for a generation that needed hope in a language they could understand. Her words quickly spread across social media. Clips of her sermon went viral, and suddenly the headlines shifted. Now, people were calling it Sarah's graceful clap back, a response that was not bitter, but bold, not disrespectful, but unshakable. And with that, Sarah's voice grew even stronger, proving that she could stand her ground without tearing anyone else down. Social media became the battlefield. Long posts appeared on Facebook, where older church members passionately argued that tradition must be preserved. Meanwhile, younger voices flooded Twitter and Instagram with words like, "Sarah gets it. She's real, she's relatable, and she's speaking to us where we are." Hashtags like #LegacyNewWave and #StandWithSarah began trending in Christian circles. Even podcasts and YouTube channels picked up the discussion, with titles like "Old School versus New School Ministry" and "Has the Church Outgrown Tradition?" What had started as a single comment in a sermon was now a full-blown public debate. Preachers, bloggers, and commentators weighed in. Some claimed Sarah was being disrespected, forced to defend herself against unnecessary criticism. Others insisted Juanita had every right to call out what she believed was a dangerous shift in the church. Behind the noise of opinions and arguments, the heart of the debate became clear. What is more important, protecting the depth of legacy or embracing the innovation of a new wave? People weren't just talking about two women anymore. They were talking about the direction of the entire future of ministry. And at the center of it all stood Sarah Jakes Roberts, carrying not only her own reputation, but the expectations of an entire generation that saw themselves in her. Away from the cameras, microphones, and social media debates, both women were carrying their own private battles. To the world, it looked like a clash of personalities and platforms. But behind closed doors, the emotions were far more complex. For Sarah Jakes Roberts, the pressure was heavy. She was no stranger to criticism, but being indirectly called out by someone as respected as Juanita Bynum cut deep. It reminded her of how often she was compared to her father, Bishop T.D. Jakes, and how people questioned whether she truly belonged in ministry. Now, she wasn't only measured against her father's legacy, but also placed in a silent competition with an icon of the past. In her quiet moments, Sarah prayed for strength, asking God to help her stay focused on her calling without letting the weight of opinions crush her spirit. On the other side, Juanita Bynum was wrestling with her own feelings. Though she spoke boldly on stage, in her heart she felt the ache of time. There was a season when her voice was the one everyone waited to hear, when her name filled arenas and her messages shaped a generation. Now, she watched as younger preachers like Sarah captured the spotlight. It wasn't jealousy alone. It was the pain of seeing a chapter close, of realizing that the influence she once had was fading. And for someone who had given her life to ministry, that feeling was not easy to carry. Both women, though on opposite sides of the conversation, shared something in common: the struggle to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued in the season they were in. Their hearts longed for the same thing: to serve God faithfully. but the tension between legacy and new wave made it feel like one had to win while the other had to lose. This unseen battle of emotions gave the public story its true depth. It was not just about sermons and statements. It was about human hearts wrestling with change, identity, and the fear of being misunderstood. The debate had been raging for weeks, with people taking sides and amplifying the conflict louder than ever. But everything began to change during one of the biggest women's conferences of the year, where Sarah Jakes Roberts was invited to speak. The room was filled with thousands of women, some there to worship, some there out of curiosity, and many quietly wondering if Sarah would finally address the storm head-on. When she stepped on stage, the atmosphere shifted. Dressed simply, carrying her Bible in hand, Sarah didn't begin with a defensive tone or a reactionary speech. Instead, she started by honoring those who came before her. She spoke of the women of faith who had paved the way, who had carried the gospel, who had fought battles so the next generation could stand free. Her words were filled with gratitude, and many immediately thought of Juanita Bynum as she spoke. Then Sarah's tone grew stronger. She reminded the audience that every move of God throughout history looked different, yet the heart of the message always remained the same. "We cannot reach tomorrow's daughters," she said, her voice firm but tender, "if we are only speaking yesterday's language. The gospel is eternal, but every generation must hear it in a way they can understand." The crowd erupted in response. Some shouted, others wept, many raised their hands in agreement. In that moment, it was clear that Sarah's message was more than a defense. It was a defining statement. She was not trying to erase the legacy of the past, but she was refusing to shrink back from the calling God had placed on her life for the present. Clips of the sermon spread almost instantly. Headlines now called it Sarah's defining moment and a new voice for a new season. What had started as criticism now turned into a turning point in her ministry. People realized that this wasn't just about a clash between two women, it was about how faith would carry forward into the future. As the dust of the conflict began to settle, something deeper started to emerge. The conversation was no longer just about Juanita Bynum and Sarah Jakes Roberts. It had grown into a larger discussion about the direction of ministry itself, about legacy and the new wave. On one side, Juanita had become the symbol of legacy. She represented years of prayer, discipline, and the kind of deep-rooted spirituality that built the foundation of the modern church. Her ministry was proof that the gospel had power to transform lives in ways that could never be forgotten. To her supporters, she was the guardian of sacred tradition, someone who refused to let modern trends dilute the seriousness of God's word. On the other side, Sarah became the symbol of the new wave. She represented a generation that was hungry for authenticity, a generation that wanted to see preachers who had scars, stories, and struggles like their own. Her style was fresh, her language was relatable, and her ministry reached into places that traditional approaches often couldn't touch. Social media platforms, podcasts, and arenas filled with young people who might have never stepped into a church otherwise. The debate between the two sides revealed something important. Legacy and new wave were not enemies, but two sides of the same story. Legacy was about honoring the roots, remembering the sacrifices, and holding onto the spiritual depth that could never be replaced. The new wave was about building bridges into the future, speaking to hearts that might otherwise never hear the message. Though the conflict had started with tension, it became clear that the real message was about balance. The church needed both the foundation of the past and the boldness of the future, and in many ways, both Juanita and Sarah embodied truths that the world desperately needed to hold on to. What people once saw as a battle now looked more like a mirror, a reflection of how ministry has always worked. Every generation carries a torch, and eventually that torch must be passed, not to erase the past, but to keep the flame alive for what's ahead. In the end, What began as a clash between two powerful voices revealed something far greater than a personal disagreement. Sarah Jakes Roberts and Juanita Bynum represented two seasons of the same mission, one grounded in legacy, the other rising in a new wave of expression. And though the world framed it as a fight, the truth was that both carried value that could not be dismissed. Sarah's clapback was never truly about attacking Juanita. It was about standing firm in her own calling, proving that God's voice moves through different vessels in different ways. Her response reminded the world that change is not a rejection of the past, but a continuation of it. At the same time, Juanita's challenge made it clear that the roots of ministry should never be forgotten, no matter how modern the methods become. The lesson left behind was simple but powerful. Ministry is not a competition. Legacy and new wave are not rivals but partners in God's greater plan. Without legacy, the new wave would have no foundation. Without the new wave, legacy would not reach the generations yet to come. Together, they form a bridge, one side anchored in history, the other stretching into the future. As time passed, the noise of the debate faded, but the message remained. People began to see the beauty in honoring the past while embracing the future. And in that balance, Sarah and Juanita's story became more than just a moment of controversy. It became a reminder that every season of ministry has its place, its purpose, and its voice. And so, the story closed not with division, but with a vision that God's work is big,